Today we're going to talk about the effects that slavery had on Britain, Africa and the Caribbean, the 3 points of the triangular trade. First to Britain. Now most of the effects that slavery had on Britain were economically beneficial, and so there are various ones that we're going to look at. First of all, obviously slavery massively increased the wealth in Britain. Certain people became extremely wealthy thanks to slavery, thanks to the importing sugar and thanks to trading slaves. Slavery also provided a huge number of employment opportunities, so there were jobs in things like sailing, as dock workers, as rope makers, essential industries that were required as part of the slave trade. There were also significant jobs available in manufacturing industries, so people making pots and pans, guns and cloth, because those were the things that were traded in Africa for slaves. The slave trade also provided a huge boost for shipbuilding and led to an expansion of docks. Obviously, in order to sail the triangular trade, you need a ship, and so slave trade led to huge growth in shipbuilding industries. Port cities, Liverpool, Glasgow, Bristol, London, were also able to grow significantly with the infrastructure required to supply and control these ships meant that there were huge growth in the docks in places like Liverpool, with massive expansion programs being built. But it wasn't just the economy in terms of jobs and workers, there was also massive growth in businesses. So ship owners or plantation owners would often take out large loans in order to send the ship around the triangular trade. For example, Barclays Bank and Bank of England would do this. They would loan a ship owner a large amount of money so that they could supply their ship, and then when the ship brought back sugar and it was sold for a large profit, these loans were paid back with interest. And the insurance industry also massively grew. Large numbers of insurance companies were offering to insure slave ships because sailing in that period was a very dangerous business, that ships could sink, they could be blown off course by the weather, and so ship owners would often insure their ships so that if the ship was lost, or if some of the cargo, the slaves, were lost, then they would receive money for their losses. But there were other benefits to Britain as well. Sugar, as we all know, is a very popular food, and so the bringing sugar into Britain provided a lot of new flavours and a lot of benefits. It also led to the money that was made from slavery led to the growth of lots of new buildings and the growth of infrastructure, streets and things like that across Britain. So while the effect on Britain was mostly positive, the effect on Africa was mostly negative. Now, a significant number of slaves were forced to become slaves because they were prisoners of war, and as the demand for slaves grew, this meant that many African kingdoms went to war with neighbouring kingdoms in order to produce more prisoners of war, which meant that they could then sell them to the slave traders. And as we said earlier, one of the things that they would get in exchange for slaves were guns, and so as they sold more slaves, they received more guns, and this led to the kingdoms becoming better armed, and if they were better armed, it meant that they could engage in war more effectively, which then led to more problems with more slaves and then more guns, and it was a vicious cycle caused by the slave trade. And a lot of the conflicts that began in that period still have lingering tensions, still have lingering effects even today. Now, the economy in Africa was also significantly affected by slavery. The transport networks on the west coast grew as slaves and goods were moved from places inwards to the coast. There were also slave ships needed a huge amount of food, so farming began to develop on the west coast of Africa, and new crops such as maize and sweet potatoes, which were used to feed the slaves on the Middle Passage, also began to be used and grown more in Africa. But obviously, while these factors were small positives, the overwhelming negative was that in order for an economy to grow, they need a large number of healthy young workers. And with the slave trade, significant numbers of Africans were being stolen from their countries and this meant that the African economies were not able to grow in the same way that the European and American economies were. Obviously, slavery also led to significant population changes, that the that young, healthy people are often engaged in farming and producing a lot of food, and without them there, this made famine much more likely, which caused significant problems for communities across the west coast of Africa. The fact that the slave traders would visit or go to places on the west coast meant that many communities and many groups would move as far away from the west coast as possible, which meant that they began to spread east, and as they spread east, this intermingling of population caused a growth in disease spreading, which further led to decreases in population. And the movement of people, in combination with the removal of huge numbers of people in the slave trade, meant that large amounts of good land on the west coast of Africa was not put to use. And good land is one of the things that drives population growth. If you can grow a lot of food, you can grow a big population. And so this caused significant problems, and it's a problem that still exists even today. There are significant areas in places like Ghana and Nigeria that remain depopulated. There are also population effects in the Caribbean. The Arawaks, who were the natives who lived in the Caribbean, were exterminated by the arrival of Europeans. The Arawaks were forced to work on plantations, and thousands of them died, and also the contact with Europeans caused diseases to spread, and so thousands of other Arawaks would die from disease. Also, the slave trade brought huge numbers of Africans into the Caribbean, which caused a huge demographic, which basically just means population change, that the population of the Caribbean became significantly ethnically African, and so in places like Jamaica, around 90% of the population can trace their roots back to places in West Africa. Now, there were also economic effects in the Caribbean, that local industries weren't able to grow because all the manufactured goods were imported, and with the economy so focused on sugar, there wasn't really space for anything else to develop. Also, because the economy was so dependent on sugar, it meant that any fall in the price of sugar was massively destructive to the Caribbean economies, and when sugar prices began to fall, the Caribbean economies really struggled. And even the money that they did make from sugar, very little of it was kept in the Caribbean or spent in the Caribbean. Almost all of that money was sent back to Britain, used to develop the British economy rather than the Caribbean one. And finally, there were significant changes in the landscape in the Caribbean. Obviously, sugar plantations began to dominate areas of the Caribbean, which replaced a lot of the small farms that had existed previously. With the growth of massive sugar plantations meant the cutting down of a lot of local plants and the destruction of a lot of local wildlife. And finally, there were a lot of factories set up to refine the sugar, and the transportation links between these factories in the interior of Caribbean islands and the ports began to develop. So we can see overall there are a huge number of effects of slavery throughout the world. Most of the effects on Britain are positive, and most of the effects on Africa and the Caribbean are, of course, negative.